The Bitterroot Mountains of Montana didn't offer mercy. But they did offer silence. For Janet Walker, silence was the only currency that mattered anymore. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The kind of day where the autumn air holds a razor-sharp chill and the sky is the color of bruised iron. Janet stood in the clearing beside her off-grid cabin, a heavy iron maul in her calloused hands. She swung it in a smooth, practiced arc. The blade bit into the round of Douglas fir with a resounding thwack, splitting the wood perfectly in two. She paused, resting the handle against her leather workboot, and exhaled a plume of white breath. Her eyes, a stormy, unreadable gray, flicked immediately to the edge of the tree line. Then, they softened as they found the small figure sitting in the dirt near the porch. Henry. He was 6 years old. A mess of unruly blonde curls and smudged dirt across his freckled nose. He was deeply engrossed in a world of his own making, driving a faded yellow toy dump truck over a mountain of pine cones. "Vroom," Henry whispered, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. "Gotta get the rocks to the base." A rare, genuine smile tugged at the corner of Janet's mouth. Looking at him, it was almost impossible to believe she had ever been anything else but his mother. He was her anchor. He was the reason she had traded the suffocating humidity of the Colombian jungles and the dust-choked streets of black site operations for the freezing isolation of the American Northwest. He was the reason the Ghost, the most lethal asymmetrical warfare specialist the United States military had ever quietly disavowed, was officially dead. "Hey, buddy," Janet called out, her voice a warm, melodic contrast to the cold wind. "How's the construction coming?" Henry looked up, his eyes wide and bright. "Good, Mom. The bridge is almost done. But the truck needs more gas." "Well, the foreman says it's almost time for hot cocoa. Wrap it up in 5. Okay?" "Okay." Janet turned back to the woodpile, lifting another log. As she did, the wind shifted. It wasn't a sudden gale, just a subtle change in the air currents whispering through the canopy. But Janet's body reacted before her conscious mind did. The hairs on the back of her neck stood at attention. A cold prickle of adrenaline. An old, familiar friend, flooded her veins. She didn't freeze. Freezing got you killed. Instead, she continued the motion, bringing the maul down, but her senses were now dialed to maximum. Listen. The forest was a living, breathing entity. It had a rhythm, the chatter of squirrels, the scolding of jays, the rhythmic tapping of a woodpecker a half-mile away. But right now, the rhythm was broken. The Stellar's jays to the south had gone dead silent. A moment later, a flock of crows erupted from the canopy about a mile down the mountain, scattering into the gray sky like ash from a fire. Someone was in the woods. Janet's mind raced through the possibilities. A lost hiker? Unlikely. They were miles off any marked trail. A poacher? Hunting season hadn't started, and a local would know better than to trespass on this ridge. Then came the sound. It wasn't a snapped twig. Professionals didn't snap twigs. It was the faint, unnatural swish of Gore-Tex fabric brushing against a damp fern. It came from the east. Downwind, they were approaching from the blind spot, using the topography to mask their advance. They found me. The thought hit her like a physical blow to the chest. The encrypted drive buried under the floorboards, the one containing the ledger of Operation Blackthorn. The data she had stolen to guarantee her leverage and her life was suddenly burning a hole in her memory. She knew they would send a cleanup crew eventually. She just prayed it wouldn't be until Henry was older. She looked at her son. He was still playing, completely oblivious to the shadow of death creeping up the mountainside. A fierce, almost terrifying wave of maternal instinct surged through her. It was a primal, savage love. They could take her life. They could take her blood. But they would not touch a single hair on her boy's head. Janet dropped them all. She didn't run. She walked over to Henry with a calm, measured stride. Panic is contagious. If she showed fear, Henry would panic. "Hey, sweetie," she said, kneeling in the dirt beside him, keeping her voice completely level. "Change of plans. We're going to play a game." Henry's eyes lit up. "What game?" "The silence game," Janet said, brushing a curl from his forehead. Her fingers lingered, memorizing the warmth of his skin. "You remember the rules? Like when we see the bears?" Henry nodded seriously. "No talking, no crying, be smaller than a mouse." "Exactly," Janet said. "I need you to go into the house. Crawl under the floor space in the pantry. And wrap yourself in the heavy wool blanket. You do not come out. You do not make a sound. No matter what you hear. Not until I sing our song." Henry's lower lip trembled slightly. Children are incredibly perceptive to shifts in atmosphere. And he could feel the sudden, icy tension radiating from his mother. "Mommy, are the bad men here?" Janet's heart shattered, but her expression remained made of stone. "Mommy's going to make sure they leave. Baby, but I need you to be brave for me. Can you be my brave little soldier?" "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. "Go, now." She watched him scramble up the porch steps and slip through the heavy oak door. Only when the deadbolt clicked shut from the inside did the mother vanish, leaving only the operative behind. Janet moved with terrifying fluidity. She didn't go inside the cabin. A cabin is a fatal bottleneck. A cabin is a coffin with windows. She slipped under the elevated porch, her fingers finding the false panel she had installed years ago. She pulled it away, revealing a heavily greased pelican case. She popped the latches. Inside rested her past, a suppressed Heckler & Koch Mk-23. A customized short-barreled rifle. 3 fragmentation grenades. A lethal Ka-bar combat knife. And a tactical rig loaded with magazines. She strapped the rig over her flannel shirt, chambered a round in the pistol, and slid the cold, heavy steel of the knife into the sheath at her hip. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of gun oil and damp earth. It was a scent she had hoped to never smell again. She slid out from under the porch and vanished into the dense undergrowth just as the first tactical laser swept across the cabin window. 200 yards away, hidden in the dense salal bushes, 5 men in military-grade tactical gear advanced in a diamond formation. They moved with the synchronized, lethal grace of Tier 1 operators. Private military contractors. Mercenaries. They were armed with suppressed carbines, thermal optics, and orders to leave no survivors. "Viper 1 to team," the pointman whispered into his throat mic. "Target structure in sight. Thermal shows 1 small heat signature inside. Probably the kid. Where's the mother? Check your sectors," the team leader replied, his voice a low crackle in their earpieces. "Intel says she's a ghost. Do not underestimate her. Breach and clear. Secure the drive. Eliminate the targets." The pointman signaled the advance, stepping carefully over a rotting log. He never saw the tripwire. It wasn't made of wire at all, but a strand of 50-pound test fishing line, perfectly camouflaged in the ferns. It didn't trigger an explosion. It didn't trigger an alarm. It triggered a heavy, suspended counterweight high in the canopy, which swung down and released a thick, sharpened branch of deadwood. Thwack! The log slammed into the pointman's chest with the force of a runaway truck, crushing his ribcage and sending him flying backward into a ravine. He was dead before he hit the ground. The remaining 4 mercenaries froze, dropping to one knee, sweeping their rifles through the trees. Man down! Man down! Where did it come from? Give me a vector. Silence descended over the forest again. A heavy, suffocating silence. The wind howled through the pines, sounding like a mourner's wail. 70 yards to their left, completely camouflaged in a ghillie hood she had woven from local moss and pine needles, Janet Walker watched them through the scope of her rifle. Her breathing was slow, perfectly controlled. Her finger rested gently on the trigger. They had come to her home expecting to find a frightened single mother hiding behind locked doors. They thought they were the hunters. They were wrong. They had just stepped into the killing jar. And in this forest, she was the apex predator. Janet exhaled, settled the crosshairs on the team leader's neck, and squeezed the trigger. A suppressed rifle doesn't sound like the subtle pew you hear in the movies. It sounds like a heavy industrial staple gun, followed instantly by the supersonic crack of displaced air. But for Viper Team's leader, there was no sound at all. At 2,800 feet per second, the hollow point round shattered his cervical spine before his brain could even register the mechanical click of the firing pin. He collapsed like a puppet with its strings brutally severed, his thermal goggles digging uselessly into the damp pine needles. Contact 12 o'clock high. The remaining 3 mercenaries, call signs Brooks, Vance, and Miller, reacted with the drilled precision of men who had survived Fallujah and Kandahar. They dropped instantly, pressing themselves into the unforgiving earth, and unleashed a torrent of suppressive fire. Their M4 carbines roared, tearing the peaceful forest apart. Bark exploded from the trunks of ancient Douglas firs. Leaves and branches rained down as a storm of lead chewed through the canopy where Janet had been stationed just 3 seconds prior. By the time the first brass casing hit the forest floor, Janet was gone. The first rule of asymmetrical warfare was beaten into her by a hardened drill instructor at Camp Perry a lifetime ago: shoot and scoot. If you stay to admire your work, you'll be buried next to it. She scrambled backward on her belly, sliding down a steep, muddy embankment with the silent grace of a striking snake. The freezing mud soaked through her flannel, chilling her to the bone. But the cold was an acid. It lowered her surface body temperature. She grabbed a fistful of wet, loamy earth and smeared it ruthlessly across her face and neck, blinding the enemy's thermal optics to the heat radiating off her skin. Down in the ravine, the incoming fire ceased. The sudden silence was heavier, far more terrifying than the gunfire. Cease fire! Cease fire! Brooks, the new acting leader, hissed into his comms. He was a hulking ex-Marine with a jagged scar across his jaw. And right now, his heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Talk to me. Does anyone have eyes on the target? Negative, Vance whispered, his rifle scanning the dense salal bushes. His breath plumed rapidly in the cold air. Thermal is blind. Too much canopy. Too much ambient moisture. She's gone. Miller, the youngest of the crew, looked at the crumpled body of their squad leader, then at the man skewered by the deadfall trap. They had been on the ground for less than 10 minutes. and their fighting force was nearly cut in half. "What the hell is this, Brooks?" Intel said, a disgruntled data pusher. "Mom, that wasn't a lucky shot. That was a center mass precision kill." "Shut up, Miller," Brooks growled, though his own tactical instincts were screaming the same thing. "Intel was wrong. We adapt. We're pivoting to secondary objective. Vance, you and Miller lay down a covering sector. I'm pushing for the cabin. The kid is leverage. We get the kid, she comes to us." Janet, crouched in a cluster of massive sword ferns 40 yards away, caught the subtle shift in their formation. Through the gaps in the foliage, she watched Brooks pivot, his rifle barrel turning away from the woods and pointing dead toward her home. Toward the floorboards, toward Henry. A cold, terrifying fury, the kind of absolute rage that turns human beings into monsters, ignited in her chest. No, she needed them moving away from the cabin. She needed them chasing a ghost into the deep timber, where the terrain was her ally and their technology was useless. She had to become the bait. Janet unclipped one of the fragmentation grenades from her tactical rig. She pulled the pin, gripping the spoon tightly. She didn't throw it at them. She threw it in a high arc over their heads, sending it crashing into a rocky outcropping 50 yards behind their position. Deeper up the mountain. 1, 2, 3, 4. Boom. The explosion tore through the silence, sending a shower of fragmented granite and dirt raining down on the forest. The mercenaries flinched, spinning around to face the blast zone. "She's flanking," Miller yelled, his discipline fraying. "She's trying to get behind us." "Push up the ridge," Brooks ordered, taking the bait exactly as Janet had calculated. "Do not let her take the high ground. Move, move, move." The three men abandoned their push toward the cabin and began a grueling, tactical crawl up the steep, wooded incline, their boots slipping on the wet pine needles. Janet smiled. It was a terrifying expression, devoid of any warmth. The hunt was on. She moved in a parallel path, using a dry creek bed to mask the sound of her footsteps. She was faster than them, lighter than them, and unburdened by 80 pounds of heavy tactical gear. While they fought the mountain, she flowed with it. She targeted the rearguard, Miller. He was lagging, struggling to maintain footing on the loose shale, his breathing ragged and loud in his headset. He kept checking his 6 o'clock, sweeping his rifle in nervous arcs. He was looking for a sniper in the trees. He wasn't looking at the ground. Janet slipped into a narrow crevice between two massive boulders just ahead of his path. She slung her rifle over her shoulder, drawing the heavy, blackened steel of her bar knife. She held it in a reverse grip, resting the blade against her forearm to prevent any stray glint of light. She waited. Crunch, squelch, crunch. Miller's heavy boots grew closer. 10 yards, 5 yards, 2. As he stepped past the boulders, his boots slipped on a patch of wet moss. He threw his arm out to catch his balance. That microsecond of distraction was all Janet needed. She didn't lunge, she exploded from the shadows. Her left hand clamped over Miller's mouth and nose with the force of a vice, snapping his head back and cutting off his radio mic. Simultaneously, her right hand drove the 7-inch combat blade upward, finding the soft, unprotected gap just beneath the back of his tactical helmet. It was over in 2 seconds. There was no struggle, no Hollywood fight scene, just the brutal, terrifying efficiency of a professional execution. She lowered his lifeless body gently to the ground, ensuring his gear didn't rattle. She wiped her blade clean on his vest, sheathed it, and unclipped his radio from his harness. Up ahead, maybe 30 yards, Vance and Brooks had paused behind a fallen redwood. "Miller, sitrep." Brooks's voice crackled over the radio network. "You're lagging. Close the gap." Silence. "Miller, acknowledge." Janet pressed the transmit button on Miller's radio. She didn't say a word. She just let the open channel broadcast the ambient sound of the wind, followed by 2 sharp clicks of her tongue. Click, click, a universal tactical signal. Enemy presence. Compromised. Then, she crushed the radio under her boot. Up the ridge, Brooks and Vance froze. The realization washed over them, chilling their blood more effectively than the Montana wind. They weren't hunting a single mother. They were locked in a cage with a demon. And the lights had just gone out. Janet melted back into the shadows of the pines, her eyes fixed on the remaining 2 heat signatures. 3 down, she thought, her mind already calculating the next intercept angle. 2 to go. The static from the crushed radio hissed in Brooks's earpiece for exactly 3 seconds before the channel went dead. Those 3 seconds felt like an eternity. Brooks pressed his back against the rough bark of a towering redwood, his chest heaving. Beside him, Vance crouched low, his night vision monocle pushed up on his helmet. Vance's face, usually set in the cocky sneer of a man who got paid $1,000 a day to break things, was pale and slick with cold sweat. "Brooks," Vance whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Miller is gone. The boss is gone. Point is gone. We haven't even seen her." "Keep it together, Vance," Brooks hissed, though his own tactical calculus was screaming a retreat. "Panicking gets you put in a body bag. We assess and adapt." "Adapt to what? A ghost?" Vance gripped his carbine tighter. Sweeping the tree line, the shadows seemed to stretch and contort, every swaying branch looking like a sniper taking aim. Intel said she was an analyst, a paper pusher who stole a hard drive. That wasn't a paper pusher who took out Miller. That was a Tier 1 operator. Brooks gritted his teeth. He knew Vance was right. Whoever Janet Walker really was, she had weaponized the entire forest. They were blind, outmaneuvered, and bleeding out in the middle of nowhere. "We're doing this wrong," Brooks finally said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "We're fighting her on her terms. In the bush, she's a force multiplier, but she has a weakness." Vance swallowed hard. "The kid." "Exactly. The kid is back at the cabin," Brooks said, his eyes narrowing as he formulated a desperate plan. "She lured us up here to get us away from the house. If we stay out here, she picks us off one by one. But if we double back, hard and fast, and breach that cabin, she has to come to us. We get the boy, we get our shield, then we radio for dust off." Vance nodded slowly, the logic cutting through his fear. "A fatal funnel. We lock down inside. She has to come through the door. On my mark, we bound back down the ridge. Do not stop to engage unless you have positive identification. Move like your life depends on it, because it does." 200 yards away, peering through the dense foliage of a cedar tree, Janet watched the 2 heat signatures huddle behind the redwood. She breathed in the sharp, pine-scented air, her heart rate resting at a terrifyingly calm 60 beats per minute. She didn't need a parabolic microphone to know what they were discussing. Tactics were universal. When cornered in hostile territory, a squad leader will always attempt to secure a defensible position or a high-value hostage. "They're going back for Henry." The icy detachment of the guerrilla fighter merged violently with the fiery wrath of a mother. They had made their choice. Now, they were going to pay the toll. Going somewhere, boys? Janet murmured to the wind. Down the ridge. Brooks threw a flashbang grenade blindly into the brush to cover their movement. The blinding white flash and deafening crack echoed off the mountainside. Go! 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 Brooks roared. The two mercenaries broke from cover. Sprinting downhill back toward the cabin. They moved with desperate speed. Sliding on the slick needles. Their heavy boots tearing up the earth. They were fast, driven by the pure, unadulterated instinct to survive. But Janet had prepared the battlefield years ago. She had mapped every inch of this acreage. She knew the game trails, the dead falls, the natural choke points. She knew that a man running downhill in full tactical gear would naturally veer toward the path of least resistance, a shallow, dried-out creek bed that led straight to the backyard of her cabin. Janet slung her rifle over her shoulder and began to move. She didn't run, she glided. She moved laterally across the steep slope, intercepting their trajectory like a predatory bird diving on a thermal current. Brooks and Vance hit the dried creek bed, their boots crunching loudly on the river rocks. They could see the roof of the cabin now, just 50 yards away through the thinning trees. Almost there. Keep pushing, Brooks yelled over his shoulder. Vance was 10 paces behind him, his lungs burning, his eyes locked on the back of Brooks's tactical vest. He was so focused on the cabin that he never looked up. He never saw the thick canopy of Douglas fir branches directly above him. And he never saw the shadow that dropped from them. Janet descended in complete silence. She hit Vance squarely in the center of his back, the sheer kinetic force of her drop driving him face first into the unforgiving river rocks. The impact knocked the wind out of him in a violent rush. Before Vance could even register the pain, Janet's knee pinned his spine to the earth. Her left hand grabbed a fistful of his tactical vest, pulling him slightly upward, while her right hand brought the heavy steel handle of her combat knife down in a brutal, precise strike against his temple. Vance's world went black instantly. Janet didn't linger. She knew Brooks was just ahead. She ripped a smoke grenade from Vance's tactical rig, pulled the pin, and tossed it directly into the creek bed between her and the cabin. Thick, acrid white smoke billowed outward instantly, creating an impenetrable wall of fog in the narrow ravine. Up ahead, Brooks heard the scuffle. He spun around, his carbine raised, only to find himself staring into a blinding wall of white smoke. "Vance!" Brooks screamed, his voice cracking with genuine panic. "Vance! Report!" Silence. Brooks backed up slowly, his weapon trembling. He was 20 yards from the cabin's back porch. He was the last man standing out of a 5-man elite hit squad. And he was completely alone in the fog. "Who are you?" Brooks bellowed into the smoke, his finger tight on the trigger. "What the hell are you?" The wind shifted, swirling the white smoke around the trunks of the pines. From the heart of the fog, a voice drifted out. It was calm, it was feminine, and it was absolutely chilling. "I'm a mother," Janet's voice echoed, seemingly coming from everywhere at once. "And you are trespassing." Brooks opened fire, holding down the trigger and spraying wildly into the smoke until his magazine clicked empty. He dumped the mag, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the fresh one. As he slammed the new magazine home, he heard the distinct, metallic clack of a pump-action shotgun chambering a round. It didn't come from the smoke in front of him. It came from directly behind him, on the porch of the cabin. Brooks froze, the blood draining from his face. He slowly turned his head. Janet stood on the top step of the porch, perfectly silhouetted against the dark timber of the cabin walls. Her face was smeared with mud, her eyes burning like cold gray stars. In her hands, she held a customized, short-barreled Remington 870, pointed dead at his chest. She had beaten him to the cabin. She had outrun him, taken down his partner, and circled around to cut off his escape, all in the span of 90 seconds. "Drop it," Janet said softly. Brooks looked at the shotgun, then at the impenetrable forest, and finally, down at his own trembling hands. The fight completely drained out of him. He let the carbine slip from his fingers. It clattered uselessly onto the dirt. Under the floorboards, wrapped tightly in a wool blanket, little Henry held his breath, completely unaware that right above his head, his mother had just finished wiping out a squad of killers to keep his world safe. The heavy thud of Brooks's rifle hitting the dirt seemed to echo for miles across the Bitterroot Mountains. Janet didn't flinch. Her eyes, cold and calculating, remained locked on the hulking mercenary. She kept the barrel of the Remington 870 leveled precisely at his sternum. "Hands behind your head, fingers interlaced," she ordered, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the undeniable weight of absolute authority. Brooks complied, his massive shoulders slumping in defeat. His breathing was ragged, white plumes of exhaustion mixing with the lingering, acrid smoke drifting up from the creek bed. "Down on your knees, cross your ankles." As Brooks dropped to the wet earth, Janet closed the distance. She didn't walk directly in front of him. She circled to his blind spot at the 4 o'clock position. In one fluid motion, she slung the shotgun, drew a heavy-duty, industrial zip tie from her tactical rig, and secured his wrists with a viciously tight pull. The thick plastic bit into his skin with a sharp zip. She grabbed the collar of his tactical vest and hauled him roughly to his feet. "Walk to the woodshed." She needed him away from the cabin, away from the floorboards. If she had to break him, she wasn't going to let Henry hear the sound of a grown man screaming. The woodshed was a dark, drafty lean to 30 yards from the house, smelling of cedar resin and old motor oil. Janet shoved Brooks inside, forcing him down onto a heavy chopping block. "Look," Brooks started, his voice a gravelly tremor. "You won. We underestimated you. Just let me call it in. I'll tell them the target wasn't here. I'll walk away." Janet pulled a small, high-lumen tactical flashlight from her belt and clicked it on, blinding him. "You don't call anything in. You don't negotiate. You are a dead man breathing on my borrowed time. You're going to tell me exactly who signed the contract. And you're going to do it before my patience runs out." Brooks squinted against the harsh glare. "I'm a contractor. We don't get names. We get coordinates and a payout." Janet leaned in close. The mud on her face made her look like a vengeful spirit of the forest. "Don't insult my intelligence, Brooks. 5 heavily armed Tier 1 operators don't mobilize for a blind hit on U.S. soil without a very specific backer. Operation Blackthorn was buried 6 years ago. Who dug it up?" Brooks's eyes widened. The fact that she knew the operation's name shattered whatever resolve he had left. You really are the ghost. I asked you a question." Janet drew the cob bar from her hip. The blade caught the beam of the flashlight, gleaming with a dark, terrible promise. Okay, Brooks spat. straining against his bindings. "It's Thorn. Elias Thorn. He's the one who bought our contract." Janet's blood ran cold. Elias Thorn, her former handler, the architect of the Blackthorn atrocities, a man who had sanctioned the slaughter of innocents in Bogotá to secure rare earth mineral rights, and then tried to have Janet's team wiped out to cover his tracks. "Thorn is supposed to be rotting in a black site," Janet whispered, the blade of her knife resting gently against the side of Brooks's neck. "He made a deal," Brooks gasped, the sharp edge pressing dangerously close to his carotid artery. "He's being vetted for the Director of National Intelligence. But he can't pass the Senate confirmation hearings if the Blackthorn ledger leaks. He knows you have the encrypted drive. He needs it destroyed. And he needs you erased." Janet processed the information with cold, terrifying speed. If Thorn was ascending to the DNI, he had the entire apparatus of the United States intelligence community at his fingertips. "There's more," Brooks stammered, his eyes wide with genuine terror. "We were just the vanguard. A localized strike team to secure the package quietly. If we don't transmit a secure success signal by 1800 hours, Thorn assumes we failed." Janet checked her tactical watch. It was 4:15 p.m. "What happens at 1800? She demanded, pressing the blade a fraction of an inch deeper. "He sends the sweepers." Brooks swallowed hard. No more subtle entries. No more ground teams trying to preserve the site. He's going to sanitize the entire grid. Armed drones. Incendiaries. He's going to burn this mountain to ash. Janet pulled the knife away. Less than 2 hours. The sanctuary she had built. The quiet life she had carved out of the wilderness for her son was over. The ghost had been forced into the light. And now the whole world was coming for her. She looked at Brooks. He was a mercenary, a killer for hire who would have murdered her child without a second thought. But she didn't have time to indulge in vengeance. She stepped behind him, locked her arm around his throat in a flawless sleeper hold, and squeezed. Brooks thrashed for exactly 7 seconds before his eyes rolled back and he went completely limp. She let him slump to the sawdust-covered floor, grabbed a roll of duct tape from a shelf, and heavily bound his ankles and mouth. He would be out for a while. Janet stepped out of the shed. The wind had picked up, carrying the bitter scent of approaching snow. She stripped off the tactical rig, hiding it and the shotgun behind a stack of cordwood. She grabbed a rag from the porch railing and furiously wiped the mud and camouflage paint from her face, rubbing until her skin was raw. She took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing her heart rate to slow, forcing the lethal operative back into the dark recesses of her mind. She walked up the porch steps, her boots heavy. She unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into the warm, quiet cabin. The smell of cinnamon and old wood washed over her, a heartbreaking reminder of the life they were about to lose. Janet walked to the pantry. She knelt on the worn rug and tapped softly on the floorboards. Tap, 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 tap. She cleared her throat, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice, and began to sing softly. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray." There was a moment of agonizing silence. Then, the faint sound of sliding wood. The false floorboard pushed up, and a small, trembling figure emerged from the darkness. Henry was clutching the wool blanket tightly around his shoulders, his eyes wide and brimming with unshed tears. "Mommy?" he whispered. Janet reached down and pulled him out of the hole, wrapping her arms around him in a fiercely protective embrace. She buried her face in his soft blonde curls, inhaling the sweet, innocent scent of him. "I'm here, baby," she choked out, a single tear escaping her iron control and slipping down her cheek. "Mommy's right here. The game is over." Henry clung to her neck, his small body shaking. "Did the bad men leave?" Janet pulled back, looking into her son's eyes. The time for hiding was done. They had to run, and the journey ahead was going to be darker and more dangerous than anything they had ever faced. "Some of them did," Janet said gently, brushing a tear from his cheek. "But we have to go on a trip now. Henry, a real adventure. And we have to leave right now." Compartmentalization. It was the psychological armor that kept operatives from going mad in the field. You take the terror, the grief, the overwhelming odds, and you lock them in a titanium box in the back of your mind. Janet slammed that box shut the moment she let go of Henry. "Okay, buddy, listen to me," Janet said, her tone shifting from comforting mother to commanding officer. It was a subtle change, but Henry straightened his posture, sensing the gravity of it. "We are playing for keeps now. I need you to go to your room. Put on your warmest winter coat, your snow boots, and grab your backpack. Nothing else. You have 60 seconds. Go." Henry didn't argue. He scrambled up the wooden stairs as fast as his little legs could carry him. Janet pivoted, her eyes scanning the cabin. It had been her sanctuary for 6 years. Every hand-carved beam, every quilt, every drawing Henry had taped to the refrigerator, it was all about to be reduced to ash. A jagged shard of grief pierced her heart, but she shoved it into the titanium box with the rest of it. Survival first, mourn later. She moved to the fireplace, grabbed the heavy iron poker, and wedged it beneath the hearthstone. With a sharp grunt of effort, she pried the massive rock upward. Beneath it lay a lead-lined lockbox. Inside was her insurance policy, a Faraday cage pouch containing the encrypted Blackthorn drive. $50,000 in untraceable, vacuum-sealed cash, and 3 passports with faces that belonged to ghosts. She shoved the pouch into her tactical pack, slung it over her shoulder, and grabbed the Remington 870. "Mom, I'm ready," Henry's voice called out. He was standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking like a stuffed marshmallow in his heavy blue parka, his dinosaur backpack strapped tightly to his chest. He was clutching the yellow dump truck in his right hand. "Perfect," Janet said, striding over and taking his free hand. "We're taking the back trail. We move fast. We stay quiet. Understand?" "Yes, Mom." They stepped out the back door into the biting Montana chill. The sky had darkened to the color of wet slate, and the first sparse flakes of snow were beginning to fall. Janet checked her watch. 16:45. 1 hour and 15 minutes until Thorne's sweepers sanitized the grid. Janet led Henry past the woodshed where Brooks lay bound and gagged. She didn't spare the mercenary a second glance. She had left him alive because killing a bound man in front of her son crossed a line she wasn't ready to step back over. Whether he survived the incoming strike was up to whatever god mercenaries prayed to. They hiked a quarter-mile up a steep, rocky incline behind the property, the cold air burning their lungs. Henry was breathing hard, his little boots slipping on the scree. But he didn't complain. Janet practically hauled him up the last 20 yards, pulling him over a ridge and into a dense thicket of old-growth pines. Hidden beneath a massive tarp woven with radar-absorbing netting was the vehicle she had spent 3 years building for exactly this moment. She threw off the netting, revealing a heavily modified 1997 Ford Bronco. It was painted matte black, stripped of all internal electronics, and retrofitted with a reinforced steel roll cage, run-flat tires, and a mechanical diesel engine that no EMP could fry. It was loud, it was ugly, and it was virtually indestructible. Janet threw open the heavy passenger door, hoisted Henry into the seat, and buckled him into the 5-point harness. "Put on the earmuffs, baby," she ordered, pointing to the heavy, noise-canceling range muffs sitting on the dashboard. "It's going to get loud." Henry slipped them over his ears, his eyes wide. Janet sprinted to the driver's side, threw her gear into the back, and climbed behind the wheel. She turned the key. The ancient diesel engine roared to life with a deafening, mechanical clatter, spitting a plume of black smoke into the pristine mountain air. 1705. She threw the Bronco into four-wheel drive and slammed her foot on the gas. The heavy truck lurched forward, tearing through the underbrush. She didn't use the headlights. She drove entirely by memory and the fading ambient light, navigating the treacherous, unmarked logging road that spiraled down the backside of the mountain. The ride was bone-jarring. The Bronco bounced violently over exposed roots and deep ruts. Janet fought the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, searching the gray sky for the telltale contrails of an MQ-9 Reaper drone. "Hold on, Henry," she shouted over the roar of the engine, though she knew he couldn't hear her through the muffs. She reached over and squeezed his knee. He squeezed her hand back, his knuckles white around his yellow dump truck. 1730. They were halfway down the mountain, plunging deeper into the timberline. The snowfall was intensifying, thick white flakes rushing at the windshield like stars jumping into hyperspace. It was a blessing. The storm would degrade thermal imaging and obscure their tracks. 1745. They hit the valley floor, the logging road smoothing out into a packed dirt trail. Janet finally flicked on the headlights. Two beams of yellow light cutting through the swirling snow. They were 5 miles from the cabin. It wasn't far enough. Come on, she muttered, pushing the heavy truck to 60 miles an hour on a road meant for 20. 1755. They reached the ridge overlook, a high point on the opposing side of the valley that offered a clear line of sight back to their mountain. Janet slammed on the brakes, throwing the Bronco into park. "Mom, why are we stopping?" Henry asked, pulling one of the earmuffs off. "I need to see it," Janet whispered, her voice tight. "I need to know for sure." She rolled down the window. The freezing wind howled into the cab. She stared across the vast expanse of the valley, locking her eyes on the distant, heavily wooded peak where their home sat in the gathering dark. 1758. The silence of the valley was absolute, broken only by the idling rumble of the Bronco's diesel engine. 1759. Janet reached across the console, pulled Henry close to her side, and pressed his face into her heavy coat. "Don't look, baby. Just close your eyes." 1800. For a terrifying, suspended second, nothing happened. Then, the sky tore open. There was no warning sound, just a blinding, actinic flash of white light that turned the twilight into high noon. 2 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles, traveling at Mach 1.3, struck the coordinates simultaneously. The visual hit first, a massive, blooming dome of orange and black fire that vaulted hundreds of feet into the air. incinerating the ancient pines as if they were matchsticks. 3 seconds later, the shockwave arrived. The sound was apocalyptic. It was a guttural, earth-shattering boom that rattled the heavy steel frame of the Bronco and vibrated deep in Janet's teeth. A gale of displaced, superheated air rushed across the valley, whipping the falling snow into a frenzied blizzard. Janet didn't blink. She stared into the inferno, watching the only home her son had ever known turn into a raging, fiery crater. The woodshed, the porch, the floorboards, vaporized. Brooks and his squad, erased. Thorne hadn't just sent a message. He had tried to wipe her from the face of the earth. Henry was crying softly into her coat, terrified by the sheer volume of the blast. Janet stroked his hair, her eyes reflecting the distant, burning orange light of the destroyed mountain. The titanium box in her mind cracked. Just a fraction, but it wasn't grief that spilled out. It was war. She rolled the window up, sealing out the cold and the smell of burning pine. She shifted the Bronco back into drive. "Are we going to be okay, Mommy?" Henry hiccuped, looking up at her with tear-streaked cheeks. Janet looked at her son, then shifted her gaze back to the dark, winding road ahead. The ghost of the pines was dead. The woman sitting behind the wheel now was something far more dangerous. "We're going to be fine, Henry," Janet said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal timbre that belonged to the operative who had once brought cartels to their knees. "But Elias Thorne is going to wish he was dead." She hit the gas, and the black Bronco disappeared into the falling snow, leaving the burning mountain behind them. 2,000 miles away from the burning mountains of Montana, the air in Washington, D.C. tasted of expensive scotch and manufactured power. Elias Thorne stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office in Alexandria, Virginia. At 58, Thorne possessed the patrician elegance of a lifelong politician and the dead, reptilian eyes of a man who viewed human lives as expendable chess pieces. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit, watching the taillights of traffic crawl along the Potomac River. In less than 48 hours, the Senate Intelligence Committee would begin his confirmation hearings for the Director of National Intelligence. It was the culmination of a 30-year career built on buried secrets, back-channel deals, and the blood of people who didn't matter. His private, encrypted cell phone buzzed against the mahogany desk. It was a heavy, modified device that ran on a closed satellite loop. Thorne picked it up. "Speak." "It's done, sir." A digitized, metallic voice crackled through the earpiece. The drones delivered the payload at exactly 1,800 hours. Complete structural vaporization. Thermal scans show nothing but ash and slag within a 200-yard radius of the target coordinates. Thorne took a slow sip of his Macallan, allowing a thin, satisfied smile to touch his lips. "And the advance team?" "Unaccounted for," the voice replied, devoid of emotion. "Viper team went dark 22 minutes before the strike. No telemetry, no comms. We assume they were caught in the blast radius." Thorne's smile vanished. The scotch suddenly tasted like ash. "Assume?" Thorne's voice dropped to a dangerous, silken whisper. "I don't pay you to assume. Did they confirm the acquisition of the Blackthorn ledger before they went dark?" "Negative, sir, but given the thermal yield of the Hellfire missiles, the drive, and anyone possessing it, would have been incinerated. The Ghost is dead." The Ghost was the most lethal asset the SAD ever deployed. Thorne snapped. his knuckles whitening around the heavy crystal glass. She survived a 3-week siege in Bogotá with a bullet in her ribs. If Viper Team went dark before the strike, it means she neutralized them. And if she neutralized them, she had time to run. Sir, even if she ran, we hit the entire grid. I want satellite retasking over the entire Bitterroot Valley. Thorne interrupted, his voice turning to ice. Every traffic camera, every gas station CCTV, every toll booth from Missoula to Idaho. Look for stolen vehicles. Look for a woman and a child. Until I have a dental match from those ashes. Janet Walker is a Class 1 existential threat. Find her, or I'll find someone who can. Thorne ended the call and tossed the phone onto the desk. He looked back out at the lights of the Capitol. For the first time in 6 years. A cold bead of sweat trickled down his spine. He had tried to crush a viper under his heel. And he had a terrifying suspicion he had only managed to wake it up. The black Ford Bronco chewed through the miles of snow-slicked asphalt. The heavy diesel engine humming a monotonous, hypnotic rhythm. It was 2:14 a.m. They had crossed the state line into Idaho an hour ago. Sticking to back roads and abandoned logging routes. The storm had worsened, wrapping the world in a blinding white shroud. Janet kept one hand on the steering wheel and reached out with the other to check on Henry. The little boy was fast asleep in the passenger seat, his head resting against the window. The earmuffs discarded on the floorboard. His breathing was soft and even. But his face was pale. His small hands still clutching the yellow dump truck in his lap. A wave of profound guilt washed over her. She had promised him a normal life. She had promised him campfires, Little League, and safety. Now, he was a fugitive, hunted by the most powerful intelligence apparatus on the planet. I will fix this, she vowed silently. I will burn Thorne's world to the ground before I let him touch you. She downshifted as the headlights caught the rusted, faded sign of a long-abandoned Sinclair gas station standing lonely on the edge of Highway 12. This was the first stop. Janet pulled the Bronco around to the back of the dilapidated building. Killing the engine and the lights. The sudden silence was heavy, filled only by the whispering wind and the soft patter of snow against the windshield. Henry, she whispered, gently shaking his shoulder. Hey, buddy, wake up. Henry stirred, blinking sleepily into the darkness. Are we there, Mom? We're making a pit stop, Janet said, unbuckling her harness. I need you to stay right here. Keep the doors locked. I'll be right outside the window. She slipped out into the freezing night, the wind biting through her heavy coat. She walked to an old, rusted-out shipping container sitting half-buried in the overgrown weeds behind the station. It looked like garbage, which was exactly the point. Janet knelt in the snow and dug her gloved hands into the frozen dirt beneath the container's heavy steel doors. Her fingers brushed against a heavy, weatherproof Pelican case. She hauled it out, brushing away the ice, and input a 12-digit biometric code on the electronic lock. The case hissed as the vacuum seal broke. Inside was the Ghost's true war chest. While the cabin had held her immediate defensive gear, this cache was purely offensive. She bypassed the extra cash and fake IDs. She had enough of those in her backpack. She reached for the communication gear. She pulled out a heavily encrypted, satellite bouncing burner phone that utilized onion routing protocols. It was virtually untraceable. Janet powered the device on. It took 30 seconds to find a secure satellite handshake. When the screen glowed green, She dialed a number she hadn't called in over half a decade. A number that supposedly didn't exist, belonging to a man who officially died in a helicopter crash in 2018. It rang twice. Then, a click. "The bakery is closed," a deep, gravelly voice answered, the voice of a man who had smoked 2 packs a day for 40 years. "I need a cake, Marcus," Janet said, the cold air pluming from her lips. "A big one. And I need it delivered to a house in D.C." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. "Ghost?" Marcus finally breathed, his voice laced with genuine shock. "We all thought you were dead. The chatter on the secure nets says the Bitterroots just got glassed by a drone strike." "They missed," Janet said, her voice hard as diamond. "Thorne sent a cleanup crew. I put them in the dirt. But he dropped a hellfire on my home. He tried to kill my boy. Marcus." Another pause. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Marcus knew exactly what that meant. "God help him," Marcus muttered. "What do you need?" "I'm going on the offensive," Janet said, her eyes scanning the dark, snowy highway. "I have the Blackthorn ledger. I'm going to leak it. But I need to blind his surveillance net first. I need a ghost route into D.C. I need weapons that can bypass federal magnetometers. And I need a babysitter." "A babysitter?" "A safe house for Henry. Somewhere off the grid, guarded by people we trust. I can't take him into the fire." "I have a place in upstate New York," Marcus said. "Old friends. Ex-Rangers. Nobody gets within 10 miles without tripping an alarm. Get him there. I'll start assembling the hardware you need for DC." But Janet. "What?" "Thorne is days away from being confirmed as DNI. He has the entire alphabet soup looking for you. NSA, CIA, FBI. You're walking into the lion's den." Janet looked back at the Bronco. Through the frosted window, she could see Henry's small silhouette. "They aren't looking for me, Marcus," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm. "They're looking for a mother on the run. By the time they realize the ghost is in Washington, it will be too late." 36 hours of driving does something to a person's mind. The hypnotic rhythm of the highway tires. The endless stretch of white lines. The constant, paranoid checks of the rearview mirror. It wears down the soul. By the time the matte black Ford Bronco crossed into the dense, snow-covered timber of the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York, Janet was running on fumes. Black coffee. And pure, concentrated rage. Henry had been an absolute soldier. He had eaten gas station crackers without complaint, slept when told, and watched the frozen American landscape blur past with wide, silent eyes. But the shadows under his eyes were growing deeper. He needed a bed. He needed safety. Janet turned off the main 2-lane highway, navigating the heavy truck down an unmarked, unplowed logging road. The trees here were different from Montana: thick maples, towering oaks, and dense clusters of birch that looked like bleached bones against the gray sky. "Wake up, sweetie," Janet said softly, reaching over to rub Henry's shoulder. "We're almost there." "Is this Uncle Marcus's house?" Henry asked, rubbing his eyes and clutching his yellow dump truck. "It is." Janet nodded. "You're going to like him. He looks a little grumpy. But he's a good man." A mile down the road, the trees broke, revealing a sprawling, heavily fortified compound disguised as a high-end hunting lodge. A 10-foot chain-link fence topped with razor wires surrounded the perimeter. As Janet approached the heavy steel gate, Two men stepped out from a camouflaged guardhouse. They were dressed in heavy winter gear, but they carried themselves with the unmistakable, relaxed readiness of combat veterans. They were holding suppressed assault rifles. Janet rolled down her window. The freezing wind bit at her face. One of the men stepped forward, peering into the cab. His eyes flicked to Janet, then to the little boy in the passenger seat, and finally back to Janet. "The bakery is open," the guard said, his voice flat. "I brought the flour," Janet replied, giving the predetermined countersign. The guard nodded, tapped a button on his radio, and the massive steel gates slowly rumbled open. Janet drove the Bronco up the sweeping driveway and parked in front of the massive timber frame lodge. The front door opened before she even cut the engine. Marcus stepped out onto the porch. He was a mountain of a man in his late 50s, with a thick, graying beard, a patch over his left eye, and a prominent limp. He leaned heavily on a polished oak cane, but there was nothing weak about the way he surveyed the perimeter. Janet killed the engine and stepped out of the truck, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. She walked around and lifted Henry out of his seat. He clung to her neck, burying his face in her shoulder, overwhelmed by the new faces and the strange place. Marcus walked down the porch steps, stopping a few feet away. His single, piercing blue eye locked onto Janet. For a moment, the hardened ex-commander looked genuinely shaken. "I'll be damned," Marcus breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "You really are alive. It's good to see you." "Marcus," Janet said, offering a tight, weary smile. "This is Henry." Marcus looked at the little boy holding the yellow toy truck. His rugged expression softened instantly. He slowly lowered himself to one knee, ignoring the obvious pain it caused him, so he was eye level with the child. "Hello there, Henry," Marcus said, his gravelly voice remarkably gentle. "I'm Marcus. I used to work with your mom a long time ago. I hear you've had a pretty long road trip." Henry peeked out from Janet's shoulder. "The bad men burned our house down." The words, spoken with such innocent, devastating honesty, hung in the freezing air. Marcus's jaw tightened, a dangerous light flashing in his eye. He looked up at Janet, silently confirming the gravity of the situation. "Well," Marcus said to Henry, forcing a warm smile, "they can't come here. I have a whole team of very big, very loud friends who make sure of it. And inside, my wife Maria is making the best chocolate chip pancakes on the East Coast." "How does that sound?" Henry's stomach gave a timely, audible rumble. "Okay. Let's get him inside," Marcus said, standing up with a grunt. The next 2 hours were the closest thing to normal Henry had experienced in days. Maria, a kind-hearted woman with steel in her spine, took charge of the boy. She fed him, drew him a hot bath, and set him up in a secure bedroom with a pile of comic books. While Henry rested, Janet and Marcus descended into the lodge's basement. It wasn't a basement, it was a subterranean command center. Racks of servers hummed in the corner. Multiple monitors displayed live feeds of the perimeter, and an entire wall was dedicated to a meticulously organized armory. "My boys swept the Bronco," Marcus said, leaning against a stainless steel workbench. "No trackers. You're clean, but Thorne's people are tearing the country apart. The FBI just issued a quiet bolo for you under a Jane Doe alias. They're watching the airports, train stations, and major highways. They're looking outward," Janet said, dropping her heavy tactical bag onto the bench. "They think I'm running away. I need to get inside DC before Thorne's confirmation hearing on Thursday morning. If he gets the DNI seat, he can bury the Blackthorn ledger forever. And Henry and I will spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders." Marcus sighed heavily. "You're walking into a fortress, Janet. Thorne has private security, Secret Service details prepping for the hearing, and half the CIA in his pocket. How are you going to get close to him?" "I don't need to get close to him immediately," Janet said, her eyes cold and calculating. "I need to get into his house in Alexandria. I need his private network to upload the ledger directly to the servers of 5 major news outlets simultaneously, bypassing his kill switches. Then, I need to make sure he knows exactly who ended his career." Marcus reached under the workbench and pulled out a sleek, black, impact-resistant case. He popped the latches and spun it around. "If you're going into Alexandria, you can't carry the heavy artillery," Marcus said. Inside the case lay a disassembled, suppressed Sig Sauer P365, compact, easily concealable, and highly lethal. Beside it were 3 ceramic combat knives that could pass through standard metal detectors, a set of lockpicks, and a specialized encrypted flash drive. "The drive contains a ghost worm," Marcus explained. "Plug it into any terminal in Thorne's house, and it will give you a 60-second window to upload your ledger before his firewall scrubs it." "It's perfect," Janet said, expertly assembling the pistol with practiced, fluid motions. Marcus watched her, his expression grim. "Janet, what if you don't make it out?" Janet paused, the slide of the pistol clicking sharply as she chambered around. "Then you keep Henry. You raise him. You tell him his mother loved him more than anything in this world." "I will," Marcus promised, his voice thick. "You have my word." Janet holstered the weapon. "I need to go say goodbye." She walked back upstairs to the guest bedroom. Henry was sitting on the edge of the bed, wearing oversized, warm pajamas Maria had found for him. He looked incredibly small. Janet walked in and knelt in front of him. The titanium box in her mind, the one holding all her terror and grief, threatened to break open. She forced it shut. She needed to be strong for him. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, taking his small hands in hers. Henry looked at her, his bottom lip trembling. "Are you leaving, Mommy?" "I have to go do a job, Henry," Janet said, her voice cracking just a fraction. "I have to go make the monsters go away so they can never, ever come back, so we can be safe. I want to come with you." A tear spilled over his eyelashes. Janet pulled him into a desperate, crushing hug, breathing in the scent of his shampoo. "You can't, baby. This is a job I have to do alone. But I need you to be my brave little soldier here. I need you to listen to Marcus and Maria. Can you do that for me?" Henry sniffled, nodding against her shoulder. "Yes, ma'am. I love you, Henry Walker," she whispered fiercely into his ear. "I love you to the moon and back." "To the moon and back," he echoed softly. Janet pulled away, kissed his forehead, and stood up. She didn't look back as she walked out the door. If she looked back, she knew she wouldn't be able to leave. 10 minutes later, Janet was sitting behind the wheel of a nondescript, silver Honda Accord that Marcus had provided, complete with clean Virginia plates. She rolled down the window as Marcus approached the driver's side. "The ghost route is programmed into the GPS," Marcus said, handing her a laminated card. "It will take you through the back roads, avoiding the federal checkpoints. Godspeed, Ghost. Keep him safe, Marcus." Janet rolled up the window and put the car in drive. As she pulled out of the fortified compound and turned south toward Washington, D.C., the terrified, loving mother vanished entirely. Only the ghost remained, and she was bringing hell with her. The capital of the United States didn't welcome Janet Walker. It merely tolerated her presence in the pouring rain. It was 11:45 p.m. on Wednesday night. Less than 10 hours until Elias Thorne sat before the Senate Intelligence Committee to be crowned the most powerful spy in the free world. Janet drove the silver Honda Accord down the George Washington Memorial Parkway. The Potomac River to her left was a ribbon of black ink, reflecting the amber glow of the street lights. She bypassed the monumental core of D.C. entirely, taking the exit toward Old Town Alexandria. Here, the power wasn't displayed in massive marble monuments. It was hidden behind wrought iron gates, manicured ivy, and multi-million-dollar colonial brick facades. She parked the Accord 3 blocks away from Thorne's estate. Pulling into a dark, tree-lined side street, she killed the engine. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the roof. Janet closed her eyes, running through the architectural blueprints Marcus had uploaded to her secure phone. Thorne's residence was a fortress masquerading as a historical landmark. 10-foot brick walls, seismograph sensors buried in the lawn, thermal cameras covering every angle of the perimeter, and, thanks to his impending confirmation, a 6-man detail of private, Blackwater security contractors patrolling the grounds. She opened her eyes. They were completely devoid of fear. She popped the trunk latch, stepped out into the freezing rain, and retrieved her gear. She dressed entirely in matte black, pulling a lightweight, water-resistant tactical shell over her Kevlar vest. She holstered the suppressed Sig Sauer P365 at her right hip, slipped the ceramic combat knives into her boots, and tucked Marcus's encrypted Ghost Worm drive into a waterproof breast pocket. Finally, she pulled a black, fitted balaclava over her head, leaving only her storm gray eyes exposed. The ghost melted into the rain. She didn't take the sidewalks. She moved through the narrow alleyways of Old Town, her footsteps completely masked by the storm. She was a phantom navigating a world of shadows, her mind calculating angles of approach, camera blind spots, and patrol timings with the cold precision of a supercomputer. When she reached the rear perimeter of Thorne's estate, she pressed her back against the wet, rough brick of the outer wall. Breathe. Observe. Through the iron grating of the back gate, she watched 2 contractors in dark rain slickers walk past. They were professionals, their heads on a swivel, assault rifles held at the low ready. But they were looking for a brute force attack. They were looking for a team. They weren't looking for a single, invisible blade. Janet waited for the patrol to round the corner of the guest house. As soon as they were out of sight, she pulled a small, palm-sized device from her tactical rig, a localized EMP emitter Marcus had cobbled together. She pressed it against the conduit pipe feeding the security camera above the gate and hit the trigger. There was a faint, nearly inaudible pop. The red LED on the camera blinked, flickered, and died. It wouldn't trigger a full alarm. Just a signal lost due to weather error on the security desk's monitors. It gave her exactly 90 seconds before they sent a man to physically check the lens. Janet scaled the 10-foot brick wall with terrifying agility, her gloved fingers finding microscopic holes in the mortar. She vaulted over the top and dropped onto the soft, wet grass inside the compound, rolling to absorb the impact. She was in. She sprinted across the lawn, keeping low, letting the shadow of a massive oak tree shield her from the house's upper windows. She reached the rear patio just as the back door opened. Janet pressed herself flat against the dark stone of the chimney. A contractor stepped out onto the patio, shining a heavy mag light into the yard. He was checking the camera she had just fried. He muttered a curse into his radio, turning his back to the chimney to look at the gate. Janet didn't hesitate. She stepped out of the shadow, closing the 5-foot gap in a heartbeat. Her left arm snapped around his neck, locking in a flawless rear naked choke, while her right hand simultaneously clamped over the slide of his pistol, preventing it from firing or cycling. The contractor thrashed, his heavy boots scraping against the wet stone. But Janet's grip was like industrial steel. She dragged him backward into the darkness of the alcove. 6 seconds later, he went limp. She lowered him silently to the ground, took his radio, and keyed the mic twice. Click, click. A false, all clear, signaled to the security desk. She turned her attention to the back door. It was secured by a biometric keypad. Janet bypassed it entirely. She drew a specialized glass cutter from her belt, scored a perfect circle in the corner of the reinforced window pane, and used a suction cup to pull the glass free. She reached her hand through the hole, unlatched the deadbolt from the inside, and slipped into the lion's den. The interior of Elias Thorne's home was suffocatingly opulent, smelling of expensive leather, lemon polish, and old money. Janet moved down the main hallway, her wet boots making absolutely no sound on the imported Persian rugs. According to Marcus's intel, Thorne's private study, and the secure terminal connected to his servers, was on the second floor. Right wing. She ghosted up the sweeping mahogany staircase. The house was quiet, save for the muffled ticking of a grandfather clock and the distant drumming of the rain. She reached the heavy, double oak doors of the study. Locked. Janet drew her lockpicks. In less than 10 seconds, the intricate tumblers clicked into place. She pushed the door open, slipping inside and closing it softly behind her. The study was dark, illuminated only by the faint, ambient light of a massive computer monitor sitting on a heavy oak desk. This was it, the nerve center. Janet crossed the room, pulling the ghost worm drive from her pocket. She woke the computer. A biometric prompt immediately flashed on the screen. Fingerprint or retinal scan required. She plugged Marcus's drive into the USB port. The screen flickered. The biometric prompt violently glitched. Lines of green code overriding the security protocols. Marcus's worm was eating through Thorne's multi-million-dollar firewall like acid through paper. System override initiated. The screen flashed. Access granted. Janet rapidly pulled the Blackthorn ledger, the encrypted drive she had carried out of the Montana ashes, and plugged it into the secondary port. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, executing a script that would simultaneously upload the agonizingly detailed records of Thorne's war crimes to the New York Times, The Washington Post, the BBC, and the Senate Intelligence Committee's secure server. A progress bar appeared on the screen. Uploading. 15%. 32%. Janet watched the bar, her heart hammering a steady, relentless rhythm against her ribs. This was for Henry. This was for the life Thorne had burned down. 68%. 85%. Click. It wasn't a computer sound. It was the distinct, metallic sound of a hammer being cocked back on a firearm. It came from the dark corner of the study, near the leather armchairs. I have to admit, a smooth, cultured voice said from the shadows. I didn't think you would actually make it this far, Janet. The desk lamp clicked on, flooding the room with yellow light. Elias Thorne sat in a high-backed leather chair. He was wearing a silk smoking jacket, holding a glass of scotch in his left hand, and aiming a customized, silver-plated 1911 pistol directly at her chest with his right. Behind him stood a massive, heavily scarred contractor, an assault rifle leveled squarely at Janet's head. "Step away from the terminal, Ghost," Thorne said, taking a calm sip of his scotch. "Or my man here paints this beautiful mahogany wall with your brains." Janet froze. She glanced at the screen. Uploading. 98%. 99%. Uploading. 99%. The progress bar on the massive monitor pulsed with a bright, steady green. To Janet, it was the only light left in the world. "You always were a blunt instrument, Janet," Elias Thorne drawled, his voice as smooth as the scotch in his glass. He didn't rise from his leather wingback chair. He just sat there, perfectly at ease, the silver-plated 1911 pistol leveled at her chest. "Did you really think I wouldn't have a contingency for you? The moment my network detected the ghost worm, a silent alarm triggered in this room. You didn't break in, I let you walk into the cage." Janet didn't look away from the screen. She didn't blink. She breathed in the scent of lemon polish and the metallic tang of impending violence. "You burned my home, Elias," Janet said, her voice a deadly, glacial calm. "You tried to kill my son." "A regrettable necessity," Thorne sighed, taking a sip from his crystal glass. "You stole property that belonged to the United States government. Specifically, to me. You left me no choice. Now, step away from the keyboard. Put your hands on your head. And maybe, just maybe, I'll let the boy live in an orphanage instead of a black site." Ping. The sound was tiny, insignificant, but in the quiet of the opulent study, it rang out like a church bell. The progress bar vanished. In its place, bold white text flashed across the black screen. "Transfer complete. Encryption keys delivered." Below it, 4 green check marks appeared next to the routing addresses for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the BBC, and the heavily guarded servers of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Thorne's smug expression dissolved instantly. The color drained from his patrician face, replaced by a mask of absolute, panicked fury. 30 years of meticulous, blood-soaked political maneuvering had just been broadcast to the world in a matter of seconds. "Kill her," Thorne screamed, slamming his scotch glass onto the desk. "Shoot the server. Kill her." The scarred contractor's finger tightened on the trigger of his M4 carbine. But the ghost was already moving. Janet didn't draw her weapon. That would take a fraction of a second too long. Instead, she dropped straight down, letting gravity pull her beneath the inevitable line of fire. The contractor's unsuppressed M4 erupted. The roar of the 5.56 rounds in the enclosed space was deafening. Supersonic lead chewed through the air exactly where Janet's chest had been a millisecond prior, shattering the multi-$1,000 computer monitor into a shower of sparks and broken glass. As Janet hit the Persian rug, her hand whipped down to her right boot. She drew one of the 6-inch ceramic combat knives and hurled it in a single, fluid, underhanded motion. The black blade spun through the smoke-filled air and buried itself to the hilt in the contractor's right thigh, severing the femoral artery. The massive man let out a gargling roar of pain, his knee buckling, his aim jerked upward, spraying a wild burst of automatic fire into the ornate plaster ceiling, raining white dust down upon the mahogany furniture. Janet rolled violently to her left, clearing the heavy oak desk just as the contractor tried to bring his weapon back down. Coming up on one knee, her right hand finally swept to her hip, drawing the suppressed Sig Sauer P365. Peefed, peefed. 2 subsonic 9mm rounds coughed from the barrel. The first struck the contractor's center mass, piercing his Kevlar vest. The second caught him cleanly beneath the chin. He collapsed backward, crashing through a glass display case with a horrifying crunch, dead before he hit the hardwood floor. The study plunged into ringing, chaotic silence. "You bitch!" Thorne lunged from his leather chair, raising the 1911. He was fast for an older man, driven by the sheer terror of a cornered animal. He fired blindly into the cloud of plaster dust. The bullet grazed Janet's left shoulder, tearing through the waterproof tactical shell and leaving a burning trench of fire across her skin. She didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. She pushed off her back foot and launched herself directly at him. Thorne tried to track her, desperately pulling the trigger again, but his hand was shaking. The shot went wide, burying itself in a leather-bound encyclopedia. Before he could fire a third time, Janet was inside his guard. Her left hand shot out, grabbing the searing hot barrel of the 1911 and violently twisting it upward, breaking Thorne's trigger finger with a sickening snap. Thorne shrieked. Janet followed through with a devastating palm strike to his throat, collapsing his windpipe just enough to rob him of his breath. As he gagged and stumbled backward, she kicked the back of his knee, forcing him violently to the floor. She stood over him, breathing heavily, the suppressed Sig Sauer aimed directly at the bridge of his nose. Blood trickled down her left arm, staining the black fabric of her jacket, but her gray eyes were utterly devoid of mercy. Thorne lay on his back, clutching his broken hand to his chest, wheezing for air. The patrician elegance was gone. He looked small, pathetic, and terrified. "Do it," Thorne gasped, spitting blood onto his own silk lapel. "Kill me. You're a weapon, Walker. It's all you know how to do." Janet stared at the man who had ordered the destruction of her life. The man who had forced Henry to hide under the floorboards while mercenaries hunted them. Her finger rested heavily on the trigger. A single pound of pressure, and the nightmare would be over. The titanium box in her mind screamed at her to pull the trigger. But she looked at the shattered computer terminal. Transfer complete. Slowly, Janet lowered the pistol. "No," she whispered, her voice cutting through the ringing in his ears. Thorne blinked, confusion mixing with the agony in his eyes. "What? If I kill you, you become a martyr," Janet said, stepping over his trembling legs. She reached down, grabbed his bleeding collar, and hoisted him halfway up so he was forced to look her in the eyes. "The agency covers up your sins to protect the institution. They give you a star on the memorial wall. You don't deserve a star. Elias." Sirens began to wail in the distance. Not one or two, but a rising, mechanical chorus echoing across the Potomac River. The FBI and the Capitol Police. The Senate committee had seen the ledger. "Hear that?" Janet asked softly. "That's the sound of your legacy burning to the ground. Every black site order, every bribe, every assassination you ever sanctioned is sitting in the inboxes of 500 federal prosecutors right now." By sunrise, your bank accounts will be frozen. Your allies will disavow you. You won't be the director of national intelligence. You'll be a traitor locked in a concrete box in ADX Florence for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life. Thorne's eyes widened in absolute, dawning horror. For a man who worshipped power and reputation, this was a fate infinitely worse than a bullet to the head. "You're dead, Walker," he rasped, tears of pain and humiliation leaking from his eyes. "They'll never stop hunting you. You can't hide forever." Janet let go of his collar, letting him drop back down to the dust-covered floor. "I don't need to hide anymore," she said, holstering her weapon. "The ghost is officially dead. And if anyone comes looking for Janet Walker." She walked to the shattered window, stepping out onto the stone ledge as the freezing rain lashed against her face. She looked back at the ruined man on the floor one last time. "Tell them the mother of Henry Walker is waiting for them." She stepped off the ledge, vanishing into the stormy Washington night just as the first wave of heavily armed FBI tactical teams breached the front gates of the estate. 3 months later, the air in Tamarindo, Costa Rica, didn't smell like freezing pine needles or cordite. It smelled of blooming hibiscus, roasting coffee beans, and the endless, rolling salt spray of the Pacific Ocean. Janet sat in a woven hammock on the wraparound porch of a small, whitewashed beachfront bungalow. The morning sun was a warm, heavy blanket against her skin, a stark contrast to the bitter chill that had once defined her life in the mountains. She wore a loose white linen shirt and faded denim shorts, her bare feet lightly pushed against the wooden floorboards to keep the hammock swaying. On her left shoulder, just visible beneath the collar of her shirt, was a fresh, puckered scar. It was healing nicely. It didn't hurt anymore. On the small wicker table next to her, a battery-powered radio was quietly broadcasting the BBC World Service. In a historic, unprecedented move, the Department of Justice has formally denied bail for former intelligence official Elias Thorne. The crisp British voice of the newscaster reported, following the catastrophic leak of the so-called Blackthorn Ledger last November. Thorne is facing 74 federal indictments, including treason, conspiracy to commit murder, and international war crimes. Sources inside the Justice Department indicate Thorne will likely spend the remainder of his life in the ADX Florence Supermax facility. Janet reached over and calmly clicked the radio off. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. The titanium box in her mind, the one that held the ghost, the tactical calculations, and the cold-blooded rage, had been permanently sealed and dropped into the deepest trench of the ocean. Elias Thorne was exactly where he belonged, locked in a concrete box. Entirely forgotten by the world he had tried to conquer. Janet picked up her mug of black coffee, taking a slow, appreciative sip. Her stormy gray eyes, once constantly scanning tree lines for snipers and shadows for threats, were now focused on the pristine stretch of white sand 50 yards away. Henry was there. He was wearing bright blue swimming trunks and a generous layer of zinc sunscreen across his freckled nose. He was deeply engrossed in a world of his own making, his knees buried in the warm sand. The heavy winter parka and the terror of the woodshed were a lifetime away. Next to him, looking slightly out of place on a tropical beach but absolutely essential, was the faded yellow toy dump truck. "Vroom," Henry whispered, the sound carrying on the gentle ocean breeze. "Gotta get the shells to the castle wall." Janet set her coffee down. A genuine, radiant smile, the kind that reached all the way to her eyes and erased years of hardship from her face, bloomed across her features. She remembered the night she had returned to Marcus's safe house in upstate New York. The moment she had walked through the door, bruised, bleeding, and exhausted, Henry had sprinted across the room and collided with her legs. He had held onto her so tightly she thought her ribs might crack. She had dropped to her knees, burying her face in his neck, and wept until there were no tears left. Marcus had kept his word. He had arranged the transport. A quiet cargo flight out of a private airfield in Maine, a boat ride down the coast of Mexico, and finally, a new set of flawless, backstopped identities that brought them here, to paradise. Janet stood up from the hammock and walked down the wooden porch steps. The hot sand felt incredible beneath her toes. She walked over to where Henry was building his masterpiece. It was an impressive fortress of wet sand, reinforced with smooth sea glass and pink conch shells. "Hey, buddy," Janet called out, her voice a warm melody against the crashing surf. "How's the construction coming?" Henry looked up, his eyes bright and completely devoid of shadows. "Good, Mom. The castle is almost done. But the truck needs more shells for the tower." Janet knelt beside him in the sand, picking up a beautifully intact, iridescent shell and dropping it into the bed of the yellow truck. "Well, the foreman says it's almost time for lunch. We've got fresh mangoes and those fish tacos you like. Wrap it up in 5. Okay?" "Okay," Henry beamed. He paused, looking out at the massive, glittering expanse of the ocean. "Mom?" "Yeah, sweetie? Are we going to stay here?" he asked, his voice small, holding a hint of the old anxiety. "Are we going to have to play the silence game again?" Janet reached out and gently brushed a damp, sandy blonde curl from his forehead. Her fingers lingered, memorizing the warmth of his skin, the steady, rhythmic beat of his pulse. She looked at the horizon. There were no drones. There were no mercenaries. There was only the sun, the sea, and the wide-open future. "No, baby," Janet said softly, her voice filled with absolute certainty. "We never have to play that game again. We are going to be as loud as we want." Henry's smile returned, brighter than the midday sun. He grabbed his yellow truck and made a loud, joyful engine noise as he drove it up the side of his sandcastle. Janet Walker sat back in the sand, letting the ocean breeze wash over her. The ghost of the pines was dead and buried. The war was finally over. And for the first time in her life, she was simply a mother, watching her son play in the sun,